I thought I was moving into a quiet suburban neighborhood, a place where the biggest concern was overgrown lawns and whose mailbox looked the neatest. But I was wrong, because the moment I crossed that street, I walked straight into the sights of someone who thought she ruled it all, the self-proclaimed president of the HOA, and she wasn't just another nosy neighbor. She was dangerous. Instead of welcoming me, she showed up at my door with what looked like a squad of local enforcers, men dressed like police, flashing fake badges, demanding compliance. She wanted to intimidate me to make sure I understood that in this neighborhood her word was law. What she didn't know was that I wasn't the kind of man you could scare with a clipboard or a counterfeit badge. She had no idea who she was dealing with. And the mistake she made that night, bringing her little police force to my doorstep, that decision would change everything. Because what Karen, the so-called HOA president, didn't realize was that I'm not just another homeowner. I'm not just another face in this neighborhood. I'm a federal agent. And her games, her fake authority, and her lies were about to collide with the truth in ways she could never have imagined. This was more than just a neighborly dispute. This was a war she thought she could win. But the higher she turned up the pressure, the more she set herself on a path toward complete destruction. And, as you'll soon see, the HOA president didn't just cross the line. She crossed it with the wrong man. Every neighborhood has that one person, the one who acts like the street is their kingdom, the sidewalks their fortress, and the neighbors their subjects. In my new neighborhood, that person had a name. Karen. Karen didn't just live on the block. She ran it, like a dictator in a cul-de-sac. From the moment I arrived, she watched everything I did. When I parked too close to the curb, she made a note. When I left my trash cans out 15 minutes past collection time, she spread whispers about new people who can't follow rules. But here's the thing. There were no rules. Not the kind she claimed existed. Karen was the kind of person who thrived on control, and when real authority wasn't hers to hold, she created it. Fake HOA policies, handwritten violation slips slipped into mailboxes, mandatory community meetings that were never authorized by anyone but her. If you didn't comply, she'd escalate. She had a small group of enforcers she paraded around like they were lawmen, dressed in thrift store uniforms and carrying cheap plastic badges. To the untrained eye, it looked official. To families just trying to keep their heads down, it was terrifying. That's how she maintained power, fear. Neighbors whispered about her behind closed doors, but in public, they nodded, smiled, and obeyed. No one dared cross her. Karen had built herself an empire out of paranoia and pretense. An empire where she could fine you for leaving holiday lights up too long, threaten you for planting the wrong kind of flowers, or shame you for parking on your own driveway. And if you resisted, her so-called HOA police would show up at your door, pounding until you opened. She was judge, jury, and executioner, at least in her own mind. But the truth was far darker. Her authority wasn't real. Her rules weren't recognized by the city, and those men in uniform, not officers, not deputies, not even security guards, just a group of neighborhood cronies she'd manipulated into playing along with her fantasy of power. They dressed the part, barked orders, and enjoyed the fear it created. Together, they looked the part of enforcers, but to anyone who actually understood authority, they were nothing more than actors in a cheap play. And here's where the irony cut sharpest. Karen had no idea who I really was. She thought I was just another newcomer she could bully into compliance. Another target who'd pay her fake fines and cower when the knock came at midnight. But she was wrong. Because I wasn't just a homeowner. I wasn't just another face on her block. I was a federal agent, an FBI agent. I had spent years investigating real criminals, people with blood on their hands, people who knew how to hide their tracks, people who lived and breathed deception. Compared to them, Karen's empire of lies was laughable, but what made it dangerous wasn't her intelligence. It was her audacity, her ability to convince others that her fantasy was real. She preyed on good, decent people who didn't know the law, who didn't know their rights, and who were too afraid to push back. And in doing so, she built a wall of silence around herself. No one wanted to speak out, because speaking out meant becoming her next target. I saw it in the eyes of my neighbors, the way they avoided eye contact when Karen drove by, the way they lowered their voices when they spoke of her, the way they recoiled when her so-called officers walked the block. It was control through intimidation, plain and simple, and I'll admit, at first I underestimated her. I thought she was just another difficult neighbor. Annoying, yes. Persistent, sure. But dangerous? Not in any real sense. That was my mistake. I hadn't yet seen the depth of her obsession. Karen wasn't satisfied with being the loudest voice on the block. She needed to be the only voice. And anyone who challenged her authority, anyone who so much as questioned her rules, would pay the price. Her timing couldn't have been worse. She thought she had chosen a weak target. Someone new. Someone unfamiliar with how things worked in her kingdom. She thought fear would break me down, that her fake police would send a message strong enough to keep me in line. But in trying to intimidate me, she'd stepped into the one place she should never have wandered, the crosshairs of a federal agent. The irony was almost poetic. Here was Karen, waving her counterfeit authority, flexing her fake laws, puffing herself up with imaginary power, while just a few doors down lived a man with the real authority she pretended to have. She was so blinded by her own ego that she never even considered the possibility, and that's what made her dangerous. Not her fake rules, not her wannabe cops, but her ignorance. She had no idea that every move she made, every lie she told, every threat she issued was digging her deeper into a hole she could never climb out of. As I watched her play her game, I felt the tension coil tighter. Because this wasn't just a woman with too much free time. This wasn't just a busybody with a clipboard. This was someone who believed her fantasy so completely that she was willing to weaponize it. She was willing to ruin lives, destroy reputations, and use fake law to push people to the brink. She thought she owned the block. She thought she owned me. And she thought she could get away with it forever. But here's the truth. Dictators always fall. The louder they shout, the harder they collapse. And Karen had just declared war on the one person in this neighborhood who had the training, the resources, and the resolve to take her down. She thought she had power. She thought she had control. But what she really had was a countdown clock ticking toward her own destruction, because the moment she brought her fake police to my door, the game changed. And as much as she believed she was running this neighborhood, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. It happened early in the morning, the kind of hour when the world is still quiet, when the streets are empty, when families are still wrapped in blankets and the sun has barely stretched across the horizon. That's when the pounding started, a sharp, relentless banging against my front door. At first I thought it was an emergency, real police maybe, or some kind of neighborhood incident. But as I reached the door and peered through the peephole, what I saw told me everything I needed to know. They weren't officers. Not even close. 3 men stood outside, their uniforms mismatched and wrinkled, the kind you buy from a surplus store or pull from the back of a Halloween rack. Their badges caught the early morning light, but even from behind the glass I could see the shine was wrong. Cheap plastic knockoffs that looked more like toys than law enforcement credentials. One of them even wore his badge upside down, and behind them, arms crossed, watching from the sidewalk like a general surveying her troops, stood Karen, the so-called HOA president. The pounding grew louder, more impatient. One of the fake officers leaned close to the doorframe and barked, "Open up!" HOA inspection, no warrant, no paperwork, just threats. I opened the door slowly, keeping my voice even, calm, professional. The same tone I'd used 100 times before when dealing with suspects who thought they had the upper hand. "What's this about?" I asked. The man in front, clearly trying to act like the leader, squared his shoulders and puffed out his chest. "Routine neighborhood compliance check," he said, his voice strained with false authority. "We need access to your garage." "My garage?" I repeated. "That's right," he snapped. "We've had reports of violations, unauthorized storage, possible code infractions. It was laughable. No real officer talks like that. No real law enforcement group shows up at dawn demanding access to a garage over possible code infractions. But they weren't here for justice. They were here for intimidation." I let a moment pass. Then I told them the truth, plain and direct. "I'm FBI," I said. For a split second, their faces flickered, uncertainty flashing in their eyes. But then the leader smirked. The other two chuckled under their breath. And from the sidewalk, I saw Karen smile. One of them leaned in closer. "FBI doesn't excuse you from neighborhood codes," he sneered. "Open the garage," that was the absurdity of it. They thought their fake HOA authorities somehow outranked federal law. They thought they could bully me into submission, the same way they'd bullied every other family on this street. But this wasn't just about me anymore. This was about how far Karen was willing to go to cement her power. She hadn't just written up fake violation slips or shouted at neighbors about trash cans. She had organized an entire squad of imposters, dressed them in counterfeit uniforms, and sent them door to door to enforce rules that didn't exist. This was her first strike. Her way of sending a message: I wasn't untouchable. She could come for me too. I stood my ground. "You have no authority here," I said firmly. "No warrant, no jurisdiction, and no right to be on my property." Their smirks widened. They didn't expect pushback. Most people caved by now, intimidated by the badges, the uniforms, the loud voices. That was Karen's playbook: create fear and the rest will follow. But fear doesn't work on someone who's trained to see through it. Still, their arrogance was almost unbelievable. One of them jabbed a finger toward me and said, "Refusing inspection is a serious violation. We can fine you. We can escalate this." Behind them, Karen finally stepped forward. Her voice cut through the morning air, sharp and cold. "You think you're above the rules?" she called out. "Everyone has to comply. Everyone." She was putting on a show for the men she'd recruited, for the neighbors who were starting to peek from behind curtains, for herself most of all. She wanted me to look small, to look weak, to look like just another resident brought to heel under her so-called authority. But I didn't move, didn't flinch, because the reality was this: Karen had made a mistake, a big one. She thought she was flexing her power when in truth she was exposing her fraud. Every threat, every fake badge, every absurd demand was building the case against her. She was handing me the evidence I needed, gift-wrapped on my doorstep. The leader of the group stepped closer, lowering his voice as though trying to intimidate me one-on-one. "Listen," he said, "you can make this easy or you can make this hard. Just open the garage." I met his stare. "You're impersonating an officer," I said flatly. "Do you understand how serious that is?" His smirk faltered just slightly. But before he could answer, Karen interjected again, louder this time, as if volume could mask her desperation. "Don't bother threatening them," she snapped. "They don't scare easy. Just write him up. He'll learn soon enough." And with that, one of the men pulled a clipboard from under his arm. A clipboard stacked with papers stamped with fake seals, fake letterheads, fake legal language designed to look intimidating. He scribbled something down and slapped the page against my chest. "Violation notice," he said. I let the paper fall to the ground. "This isn't worth the ink it's printed with," I told him. The neighbors were watching now. Windows cracked open. Curtains parted. The show was unraveling, and Karen, realizing she wasn't winning the scene the way she had imagined, turned on her heel and stormed off, barking orders for her fake police to follow. But as they left, one of them muttered under his breath, "You'll regret this." Maybe they believed that. Maybe they thought their charade could hold up forever. But as I stood there, the sun finally breaking over the rooftops, I knew the truth. Their little act might have worked on others, but not on me. Not on someone who had spent years seeing through criminals far smarter than them. This was just the beginning. The first attack, the first attempt to scare me into silence, Karen had made her move. She'd sent her fake army to my door, confident they could break me the way they'd broken others. But instead of fear, all she had done was light a fuse. Because while she thought she was writing me up for violations, what she was really doing was writing her own downfall. And soon the whole neighborhood would see just how deep her deception went. This wasn't intimidation anymore. This was war, and I wasn't about to lose. I thought it was just neighborhood drama, petty power games, fake HOA letters. Karen and her army of wannabe enforcers playing dress-up in dollar store uniforms. But then my phone rang. It was my boss, and his voice carried the kind of weight that makes your stomach drop before the words even. "Register, we have a problem," he said. Those 4 words felt heavier than any. Fake badge slammed against my chest. I stepped. Out of the office I shared with 3 other agents, closing the door behind me and pressed the phone tighter to my ear. "What kind of problem?" I asked carefully. "Official complaints," he said. "Filed directly against you. Multiple." My blood ran cold. "Complaints. Official complaints. Not rumors, not whispers, not neighborly grievances, but formal documents delivered to the Bureau, stamped, logged, and taken seriously." "What kind of complaints?" I asked, my voice lower now, each syllable measured. He hesitated, never a good sign. "Allegations of misconduct. Abuse of authority. Harassment. The word hit like a gut punch. I knew immediately where this was coming from. Karen. She wasn't satisfied with neighborhood intimidation anymore. She wasn't satisfied sending her fake police to pound on my door. No, she had escalated. She had found a way to reach into the one place she knew could actually hurt me. My career. I straightened, jaw tightening. "Sir, these complaints are false." "That may be," my boss said, his tone firm but careful. "But internal affairs is already looped in. They don't ignore things like this. Internal affairs." The words echoed in my mind like a gunshot. I'd seen careers end over less. Agents sidelined. Investigations dragged out for months. Promotions frozen. Reputations shredded. Even if you were innocent, the stain lingered. Suspicion clung to you like smoke. I exhaled slowly. Understood. There was a long pause on the line. Then my boss said almost gently, "Keep your head down. Don't give them more ammunition." And just like that, the call ended. I stood in the hallway, phone still pressed against my ear even though the line was dead, my reflection in the glass door staring back at me. For the first time, the fight with Karen didn't feel like some absurd neighborhood squabble. It felt like a noose tightening, because if she could reach this far, if she could drag my name into official channels, then she wasn't just a nuisance. She was a threat. The changes at work came fast. At first, it was subtle. Colleagues who used to nod as I walked by suddenly looked away. Conversations died when I entered the break room. Files I should have been briefed on never made it to my desk, and then came the looks, the side-eye glances, the whispers. I caught two younger agents talking near the coffee machine. One leaned in close to the other, murmuring, "That's him. That's the one under review." My fists clenched, but I said nothing, because anything I said could be twisted, misinterpreted, weaponized. At my desk, I scrolled through my case notes, but the words blurred. Focus slipped, because how could I concentrate on investigating others when I was now the one under the microscope? Every knock on my office door made my pulse spike. Every email notification felt like a warning. Every time my boss cleared his throat during a meeting, I braced for him to say my name. It was working. Karen's plan was working. She had managed to make me feel cornered, not just in my own neighborhood, but in the one place I was supposed to be untouchable: my career. The first formal interview with Internal Affairs was scheduled 3 days later, a plain conference room. Neutral walls, two investigators with notepads and steady eyes. They asked about Karen, about the neighborhood, about multiple reports of intimidation and harassment. I told them the truth, laying it out step by step. The fake police, the bogus violations, the harassment at dawn. But as I spoke, I could feel their skepticism. Not open disbelief, but the kind of quiet doubt that says, "We're not here to believe you. We're here to catch you slipping." When I finished, one of them leaned back in his chair and tapped his pen against the table. "So you're saying," he began slowly, "that this neighborhood president orchestrated a campaign to discredit you? That she's behind all these complaints?" "Yes," I said firmly. "That's exactly what I'm saying." The other investigator exchanged a glance with his partner. Then he scribbled something down and asked, "Do you have proof?" "Proof." The word hung in the air like a blade. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. Proof? I had stories, incidents, harassment that neighbors whispered about but wouldn't dare testify to. A paper trail of fake letters that could be dismissed as petty disputes. But proof? Hard, irrefutable evidence that Karen was behind the complaints? That I didn't have. Not yet. The interview ended with polite nods and unreadable expressions. But the damage was done. Afterward, I walked the bureau hallways, the fluorescent lights buzzing above, and for the first time, I felt like a stranger in my own building. This wasn't just about losing a case or a reprimand. This was about everything: my career, my livelihood, my reputation. Because in the bureau, reputation is currency, and mine was bleeding out fast. Every glance from a coworker became a judgment. Every missed opportunity, every delayed email, every lack of invitation to a meeting became evidence that I was being cut out, isolated, marked. And all the while I could picture Karen smiling in her spotless suburban kitchen, satisfied that her plan was unfolding exactly as she intended. She didn't need to beat me in the neighborhood anymore. She was trying to erase me from the inside out. The weight pressed down hardest at night. I'd sit at my kitchen table, files spread out in front of me, trying to prepare for whatever came next. But my eyes kept drifting to the garage. The very garage they'd demanded access to during that absurd morning raid. It wasn't just a garage anymore. It was a symbol. They wanted inside. They wanted to own the narrative. And now they wanted to own me. The thought twisted my stomach. Because if they could make enough noise, if they could convince enough people, if they could stain my name just enough, then internal affairs wouldn't need evidence. They'd just need suspicion. And suspicion was enough to end everything I had built. The career, the respect, the future, all of it could be ripped away by one woman and her gang of imposters. And so I felt trapped between two lives, one at home, under siege from Karen's fake authority, and one at work, where her influence was bleeding into the corridors of power. There was no escape, no safe ground left to stand on. That's when the fear set in, not for my house, not for my pride, but for my life as I knew it, because Karen had escalated beyond pettiness. This wasn't about trash cans or lawn height or garage inspections anymore. This was about total destruction. She wanted me out of the neighborhood, out of the bureau, out of everything. And if I didn't fight back, if I didn't find a way to turn this tide, then she just might succeed. This was no longer neighborhood drama. This was war on two fronts, and one wrong step could cost me everything. Then came the twist. The kind of twist that doesn't just bend the story, it shatters it. Until that moment, I thought Karen was nothing more than a suburban tyrant. A bully with too much free time and an obsession with control. She made up rules, hired fake enforcers, and tried to ruin me with bogus complaints. And I told myself, if I just hold the line, if I just gather evidence, if I just stay patient, the truth will win. But the truth wasn't the only weapon in play. Because one afternoon, sitting in a sterile bureau inquiry room, I learned just how deep her influence ran. The room was quiet. Two investigators sat across from me, their notepads filled with the same questions phrased a dozen different ways. The walls were bare, deliberately bland, as if neutrality itself could force out the truth. I was tired of defending myself against invisible accusations, tired of walking the halls of my own workplace like a marked man, tired of living two lives, one under siege in the neighborhood and one under suspicion at the bureau. And then the door opened. The sound was sharp, metallic, echoing like the crack of a gavel. I turned my head expecting another agent, maybe a clerk with paperwork, but it wasn't. It was Karen, not Karen in yoga pants barking orders across her lawn, not Karen waving a clipboard and pointing to imaginary violations, not Karen surrounded by her army of plastic badge enforcers. This Karen was different. She wore a tailored suit, dark navy, sharp enough to cut through the room. Her hair was perfectly set, makeup subtle but deliberate. She looked less like the dictator of a cul-de-sac and more like a corporate executive stepping into a boardroom she already owned. For a second, I couldn't process it. What was she doing here? How had she even been allowed past security? But then she smiled. That same smug, self-satisfied curl of the lips I'd seen 100 times across the street. Only now it wasn't the smile of a petty neighbor. It was the smile of someone who knew she was about to change the game. "Good afternoon," she said smoothly, her voice carrying authority it hadn't earned. "I'm here to provide testimony." The investigators nodded, like this was normal, like this was expected. I sat frozen, my pulse thundering in my ears. She sat down at the table directly across from me, folding her hands neatly, like she'd rehearsed this moment. And when her eyes met mine, there was no malice, just victory. Then she spoke the words that made everything snap into focus. "My uncle," she began casually, "is the deputy director of the FBI." The room spun. Not literally, but my mind reeled as if the floor had tilted. The deputy director. One of the most powerful men in the Bureau, a name everyone knew. A man who sat at the very top of the chain of command, and she was his niece. In that instant, every unanswered question clicked into place. Why my boss had sounded hesitant, almost nervous during our calls. Why internal affairs had moved so quickly. Why her complaints, baseless, absurd, laughable, had been taken so seriously, so fast. It wasn't about evidence. It wasn't about truth. It was about power, and Karen had it. She leaned back in her chair, her composure flawless. "I take the integrity of this Bureau very seriously," she said, her words deliberate, crafted to sound righteous. "When someone in my community abuses their authority, I feel it's my responsibility to speak up. For the safety of the neighborhood, for the safety of the people. Abuse of authority." That was her angle. She had flipped the narrative perfectly. I wasn't the federal agent standing up against her lies. No, she was painting me as the bully. The abuser, the threat. And with her uncle's shadow looming over the room, the investigators listened. They didn't interrupt. They didn't challenge. They wrote notes. They nodded. Meanwhile, I sat there, forced to watch her spin her fiction into something dangerously close to fact. It was theater. And she was winning. The irony burned. Here I was, a trained federal agent, sworn to uphold the law, bound by evidence, procedure, truth. And across from me sat a suburban dictator who had turned her backyard tyranny into a weapon powerful enough to shake my career. She had no real authority, yet she wielded more influence in that room than I did. And the cruel twist? She thought she was the one protecting the system, when in reality she was corrupting it from the inside. As she spoke, I thought back to the beginning. To the morning when she showed up at my door with her fake police pounding like they had a warrant. How absurd it had felt. How laughable it should have been. But now, looking at her in that suit, backed by the weight of her uncle's position, I realized something chilling. Karen wasn't just playing make-believe anymore. She had crossed the line. Her power wasn't just fake anymore. It was real. Because the system wasn't laughing her out of the room. The system was listening to her. When she finished her testimony, she slid a folder across the table. Thick, stuffed with papers. Documented complaints, she said smoothly. Statements from neighbors. Records of his behavior. The investigator on the left flipped it open, scanning quickly, nodding again. I knew what was inside. Fabrications. Exaggerations, maybe even coerced testimonies. She had probably bullied half the block into signing whatever she shoved under their noses. But in that moment, the truth didn't matter. The optics did, and the optics were damning. As she stood to leave, she gave me one last glance. Not defiant, not hostile, just certain. Like she already knew how this story ended. The door shut behind her, and the silence in the room pressed down like a weight. The investigator finally spoke. "We'll take this under review," but the words felt hollow, because I knew what was really happening. This wasn't a review. This was a setup. Walking out of the bureau that evening, I felt the walls closing in tighter than ever before. I wasn't just fighting a neighbor anymore. I wasn't just defending my home. I was up against the system itself. Because when your enemy's family sits at the top of the organization you serve, you're no longer battling lies. You're battling legacy, and in that fight, truth alone might not be enough. From that day forward, everything changed. Every knock at my door, every email in my inbox, every glance from a colleague, all of it carried a new weight. Because now I knew that Karen's power wasn't just in her arrogance. It was in her bloodline, in her connections. She wasn't just a neighbor anymore. She was a player in a game I had no choice but to play. And if I wanted to survive, not just in the neighborhood, but in the bureau itself, I'd have to rewrite the rules, because Karen had revealed her hand. And the twist was clear. I wasn't just fighting her. I was fighting the system she belonged to. I'd been cornered. Karen had dragged my name into the bureau, poisoned my workplace, and flexed the kind of power most neighbors could only dream of. But no matter how dark it got, one truth remained. I wasn't helpless. I was trained to find cracks in armor, to follow threads until they unraveled the whole fabric, to turn pressure into opportunity. And that's when I decided, if Karen wanted to play this like a war, then it was time I fought back. But to win, I needed allies. And I needed evidence. The first person I called was Detective Alvarez. He wasn't FBI. He wasn't polished or political. He was a local cop who'd spent decades walking the beat, dealing with real criminals, not suburban tyrants. I'd worked with him before on joint operations. He was sharp, grounded, the kind of man who saw through smoke and mirrors. When I explained what was happening, he didn't laugh. He didn't dismiss it as neighborhood drama. Instead, he said, "Bring me everything you've got. I'll start digging." So I did. I handed him copies of the fake citations Karen had left in my mailbox, notes of the so-called violations, even photographs of the officers she paraded through the block. The men in dollar store uniforms, their shiny plastic badges catching the morning sun. Alvarez studied the photos and shook his head. "They're not cops. Not even close. No licensing. No registration. These guys are playing dress-up. That's a crime in itself." Hearing those words was the first spark of hope I'd felt in weeks, because up until then Karen had seemed untouchable. Her power came from intimidation, from smoke and mirrors. But Alvarez had just confirmed the truth. Her empire was a facade, but knowing wasn't enough. I needed proof, hard proof, evidence that could withstand scrutiny from the Bureau, from internal affairs, from anyone Karen threw at me. And that's when Tamara stepped in. She was a neighbor I'd barely spoken to before all this began. Quiet, reserved, the kind of person who usually stayed behind her curtains when trouble broke out. But one evening she knocked on my door, nervously clutching a folder. "I've had enough," she whispered. Inside the folder were copies of flyers Karen had shoved under doors. Fake HOA newsletters filled with rules no one had voted on, fines no one could afford, threats written in bold print. She fined me $300 for planting the wrong color flowers, Tamara said, her voice shaking. When I refused to pay, those fake cops came to my house. They scared my kids. I can't let this keep happening." Her hands trembled as she passed the papers to me, but her eyes carried something stronger than fear. Resolve. That's when I realized I wasn't the only one under siege. I was just the first one to push back. Together, Tamara and I started gathering more. She introduced me to others in the neighborhood, people who had quietly endured Karen's reign but never dared to resist. One by one, they opened up. An elderly couple showed me citations demanding payment for leaving their Christmas lights up too long. A young father handed me photos of the fake officers pounding on his door at midnight. Another neighbor revealed voicemails Karen had left, dripping with threats and false authority. Piece by piece, the picture came together. Karen wasn't just a bully. She was a fraud. She wasn't protecting the neighborhood. She was terrorizing it, and now I had witnesses. I had allies. Detective Alvarez met with us in a small diner just outside the neighborhood. He listened as each person told their story, his pen scratching across a worn notepad. When it was my turn, I slid the growing pile of evidence across the table. Flyers, citations, photos, audio recordings. Alvarez nodded slowly. This is good. This is real. If we build this right, it'll stand. For the first time, I felt the scales shifting. Karen might have had her uncle in the deputy director's chair, but I had something stronger. Truth, backed by the voices of the people she thought she'd silenced. Still, I knew the danger. Every move I made had to be precise. If Karen caught wind of what we were building, she'd strike harder, faster. And with her connections, one wrong step could erase everything. So we worked in the shadows, late-night meetings, quiet conversations on back porches. Evidence slipped into folders and tucked away like contraband. I trained my neighbors to document everything, time-stamped photos, copies of every note, recordings of every interaction. We weren't just gathering scraps anymore. We were building a case, and the more we built, the clearer the picture became. Karen wasn't strong because she had real authority. She was strong because she convinced everyone she did. She thrived on fear, on silence, on compliance. But now the silence was breaking. One night, as Tamara and I reviewed the latest stack of documents at my kitchen table, she looked up at me and said something that stuck. For years I thought I was alone, that I just had to live with it. But seeing you fight back, it makes me think maybe we don't have to be afraid anymore. That was when I realized this wasn't just about me. It wasn't just about saving my job or clearing my name. It was about freeing an entire community from the grip of a woman who thought she owned it. And with every file, every photo, every voice that joined us, Karen's empire cracked a little more. The irony wasn't lost on me. She had tried to destroy me with the system, complaints, connections, influence. But in the end, it was the community she claimed to protect that would destroy her. Because when you strip away the fear, when you shine light on the lies, there's nothing left for a fraud to hide behind. And I was ready to be that light. I knew the final battle was coming. A community meeting was scheduled, one Karen herself had called, no doubt to flex her power again, to remind everyone who was in charge. But this time, things would be different. This time, she wouldn't be the only one holding the microphone. This time, the truth would finally be heard, and thanks to Alvarez, Tamara, and every brave neighbor who chose to stand beside me, I was ready. Karen thought she had crushed me. She thought she had buried me under suspicion and fear. But all she had done was force me to fight smarter, to fight harder. And when the showdown came, she would see just how big a mistake she had made, because now I had allies. Now I had evidence, and soon I would have justice. I'd heard whispers about it all week. Karen was planning her biggest community event yet. She'd rented the town hall, plastered the neighborhood with flyers, and even bragged that she had special announcements that would change the neighborhood forever. I knew exactly what that meant. Another power grab. Another stunt to make people believe she was more than just a bored suburban tyrant. But this time, I wasn't going to watch from the sidelines. I had the evidence. I had the allies. And I had one goal: end her reign in front of everyone she thought she controlled. The night of the meeting, the hall was already packed when I arrived. Rows of folding chairs stretched to the back wall, every seat filled with homeowners who looked more nervous than hopeful. At the front, Karen stood under a banner that read, "Neighborhood Compliance and Safety." Her police lined the stage. 3 men in cheap tactical gear, dollar store badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Their arms crossed, their chests puffed out, they scanned the crowd like Secret Service agents. Except everyone here knew the truth now. These weren't officers. They weren't licensed security. They were props in her show. Still, the intimidation worked. You could feel it in the silence of the room, in the way people whispered without looking up. Fear hung in the air like fog. Karen stepped to the microphone with a smirk that told me she thought she'd already won. "Good evening, neighbors," she purred. "We are here tonight because some people believe they are above the rules, that they can move into our community and disrupt the order we've built. But not on my watch. Not while I'm here to protect you." The audience clapped politely. Some nodded, though their faces said they were exhausted. Others just stared at the floor, too beaten down to resist. That's when I stood. My chair scraped against the linoleum, echoing louder than I expected. Dozens of heads turned, eyes widening when they saw it was me, the so-called troublemaker. The man Karen had painted as a danger to the neighborhood. I didn't wait for permission. I didn't wait for her fake guards to move. I walked straight to the center aisle and raised my voice. "This meeting, this entire operation is a scam." The crowd gasped. The fake cops tensed, their hands twitching near their belts, but I kept my eyes on Karen. Her smile faltered for the first time. "Excuse me?" she snapped, gripping the microphone tighter. "You heard me," I said, steady and clear. "You've been lying to everyone here. These officers aren't officers. They're not licensed. They have no legal authority. And you," I pointed directly at her, "you've been threatening, extorting, and intimidating people with fake citations and bogus rules. It ends tonight." The room broke into murmurs. People turned to each other, whispering questions. I could see doubt sparking in their eyes, the kind of doubt that spreads like wildfire once someone finally dares to speak the truth. Karen laughed, but it was forced, brittle. "Neighbors, don't be fooled by this man. He's dangerous. He's been under investigation. He's trying to destroy the peace we've built." I pulled my phone from my pocket and tapped the screen. "Really? Then explain this." On the projector behind her, Alvarez's official report flickered into view. Photos of the fake badges, the phony citations, the receipts showing bulk orders of uniforms from costume shops. Gasps rippled through the room. Someone shouted, "That's where my fines went!" Another, "I knew those tickets weren't real." Karen tried to keep control, her voice rising over the chaos. This is fabricated." "He's twisting things." "Then explain this," I cut in, swiping to the next slide. A video played of Tamara, brave enough to speak out, describing how Karen threatened to have her house seized if she didn't pay compliance fees. Her voice shook, but her courage filled the hall. The room erupted. People stood, pointing at Karen, their fear replaced with anger. "This is fraud. You lied to us. You stole our money." Karen pounded the podium, her face red, her voice shrill. "Silence! You will all regret this rebellion!" My uncle, and that's when the doors opened. Officer Alvarez stepped inside, flanked by 2 uniformed police officers. Real ones. Their presence was undeniable. The authority in their stride, the weight of their real badges catching the light. The room hushed instantly. Karen froze, her mouth hanging open. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded. Alvarez's voice was calm, but sharp enough to cut glass. "The meaning, Ms. Harper, is that your little game is over. We've reviewed the evidence. You're under arrest for impersonating law enforcement, fraud, and harassment." The fake cops shifted uneasily. One of them muttered, "She said this was legal." But when the officers approached, they dropped their plastic badges like hot coals, hands raised in surrender. The crowd roared. Applause, cheers, even laughter. The spell was broken. Karen thrashed as the cuffs clicked around her wrists. "You can't do this. My uncle will protect me. I'll ruin all of you." But no one believed her anymore. Not with the proof on the screen. Not with the real police taking her away. As she was led past me, her glare burned hotter than fire. But I didn't flinch. I just said one thing. "You should have picked a different neighbor." The room erupted again, louder this time, not in fear, but in freedom. Neighbors clapped me on the back, shook my hand, thanked me for standing up when no one else could. For the first time since I'd moved into that quiet little suburb, the air felt lighter. The tension was gone. And as Alvarez nodded at me from across the room, I knew one thing for sure. Karen's empire of fear was finished. Justice had come, not in the shadows, not behind closed doors, but in front of everyone she'd ever tried to control. And it was the sweetest ending I could have hoped for. In the end, it all unraveled faster than even I expected. Karen's arrest wasn't just a spectacle for the neighborhood. It was the beginning of her downfall. That night, as she was led out of the community hall in handcuffs, the cameras from local news outlets caught everything. Within hours, her mugshot was on television, plastered across websites and social media. The so-called queen of the block was suddenly the face of suburban fraud. But the scandal didn't stop with her. Her uncle, the deputy director of the FBI, had spent years building his career on reputation and image. When reporters discovered his niece was running a fake police racket under his nose, the questions started pouring in. Did he know? Was he protecting her? Was his position compromised? The Bureau doesn't tolerate the stink of corruption. Within a week, her uncle announced his resignation for personal reasons. Everyone knew the truth. He'd stepped down to avoid dragging the FBI into her mess. And just like that, Karen lost her biggest shield, her fake cops. They vanished the moment the real police put her in the back of a squad car. A few of them tried to claim they'd been deceived into thinking it was all legitimate, but no one bought it. They'd been happy to play dress-up, happy to intimidate families with their cheap uniforms and plastic badges. Now, without Karen feeding them lies, they melted back into obscurity. The HOA flyers disappeared from doorsteps. The bogus citations stopped showing up in mailboxes. The threats, the intimidation, the endless sense of dread, it was gone almost overnight. For the first time since moving in, the neighborhood felt like a community again. People smiled when they passed each other on morning walks. Kids played in driveways without their parents looking over their shoulders. Families actually stepped outside to talk, to share stories of what they'd endured. It was like everyone had been holding their breath and finally, they could exhale. As for me, the Bureau had questions, of course. Internal Affairs reviewed every complaint Karen had filed against me. They combed through my record, looked at every action I'd taken since moving into the neighborhood. For a few days, the pressure was unbearable. I wondered if Karen's lies would stick, if her poison would taint my career forever. But facts are stronger than fiction. The evidence Alvarez and I collected, the fake badges, the fraudulent citations, the testimonies from neighbors like Tamara, it all cleared my name. The official word came in a call from my boss. "You're in the clear. Clean record. Keep doing your job." That was it. My career, my reputation, my life, it was safe. I can't describe the relief I felt in that moment. It wasn't just about keeping my job. It was about knowing the truth had won. Knowing that no matter how many lies Karen had spun, no matter how powerful she pretended to be, justice had a way of cutting through the noise, and justice had cut her down. Weeks later, I drove through the neighborhood and saw something that made me stop. Karen's house, once the fortress of her fake empire, was empty. Curtains drawn, for sale sign crooked in the yard. The place looked smaller, weaker without her presence. Just another house on just another street. It struck me then. Bullies build castles out of paper, but when the fire comes, there's nothing left but ash. The neighbors gathered one evening, a kind of impromptu celebration. No speeches, no formalities, just relief and gratitude. They thanked me for standing up, for not bowing to Karen's pressure. But the truth is, I couldn't have done it alone. Alvarez, Tamara, every neighbor who found the courage to speak, that's what brought her down. It wasn't just me. It was all of us, finally refusing to live in her shadow. Looking back, I realized Karen's greatest mistake wasn't trying to intimidate me. It wasn't even dragging my name through the mud. Her fatal error was underestimating who I was, what I stood for, and what I was willing to fight for. She thought I was just another neighbor, just another name on her fake citation list. She had no idea she was picking a battle with someone trained to uncover the truth. Someone who wouldn't break under pressure, and in the end, her empire of fear collapsed because of it. Now, when I step outside in the morning, the air feels lighter. The streets feel safer. The neighborhood feels alive again. It's quiet. Not the suffocating quiet of fear, but the peaceful quiet of freedom. Justice was served. Karen was exposed. Her uncle resigned in disgrace. The fake cops scattered. My name was cleared. And the neighborhood? It breathed again, free of the chokehold she'd put around it. As for Karen, she's gone and none of us are looking back. Don't let injustice go unnoticed. Subscribe to HOA Truth Tales and hit the bell to uncover the real stories behind HOA drama, tyranny, and neighborhood battles. If you've ever faced a bully in your community, comment below. We want to hear your story. Every like, share, and comment helps shine a light on the truth, and every subscriber joins the fight against unfair HOA rules. Stay tuned, because the next shocking story could be happening right in your neighborhood.